So, hello back, everyone, to my podcast on philosophy and all the rest. And we talk today about what?
Solaris and truth, and how we
Solaris and truth, and what else?
trying to understand how to justify our positions to ourselves, right? Or that is what we're trying to.
That's what we do another time. Right now,
Oh,
we talk about Solaris.
okay,
We
okay.
will also talk in another podcast about our positions on truth, or maybe it's related to Solaris. I
I
guess
think
it's
no,
related.
no, it is related because there's a question about um, how to evaluate scientific evidence,
Yes.
right? And how our own perspective in asking questions shapes the answers that we get and the limits to how we can ask questions. So that's why maybe I was jumping ahead too much,
No, no, no,
but but
great.
but but they do segue together. They merge.
It's a great indication. So Solaris, it's a book from Stanislaw, and there are two movies, which I watched one movie. I don't remember it anymore. It is usually heavily criticized. It has great pictures, as you can see, right?
Hmm. So,
Um,
so this would be from the I don't know who the director, but the Clooney version, not
yeah,
the Tarkovsky version.
Soderbergh.
Sotomayor. Oh, okay.
Yes,
Oh, okay.
it's a great director,
Oh,
but
okay. But difficult subject
yeah,
and difficult to sell to Hollywood. I think like the value of the story, I think, is difficult to sell to Hollywood. And Lem, is that how?
yeah.
That's the anglicized version of the
Yeah,
name.
I asked a
Uh,
Polish friend.
oh, okay.
So you say Stanisław?
Stanislaw.
Yeah,
Okay.
and
Okay.
then
Because at
Lem.
home we say Stanislaw, but that's
Yeah, I
not
also
correct.
used to say it
Oh,
like
okay.
that, yeah.
Okay.
But it has this L with a stroke through.
Yes. Yeah, which we don't have, so we don't know how to
So you can say
interpret.
Stanislav.
Okay,
That's
as long
okay.
as that's not going to. Right.
National identities.
We'll get there.
We say
We'll
bye to the
get there.
Polish viewers. Come for the next one.
Right. Having to look up the pronunciation for Polish Ukrainian, poppy seed cake
Mm.
for Christmas. Um, but yeah, with like Lem had mentioned, even with the Tarkovsky version, that some of the ideas weren't fully captured
Yes.
in the movie, even though the Tarkovsky version was very well received. Like I think Lem made a joke. It's not about like space romance, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, that's what I would have called the book, not Solaris.
Yeah.
He was saying it was about the question of how we engage with the other. And so, do you want to maybe give more of an introduction to the book before I
Yeah,
start ranting?
it's
Yeah.
maybe good point.
Yeah.
So yeah, we have this space traveler who comes to the station, and I have read the book 20 years ago, as you told me you have read it like
10,
10 years
15?
ago.
Yeah, yeah.
But it still has a vivid impression in my mind, because the content of the book was really great, but of course
Mhm.
I've forgotten all the names, so I looked up the names. So
Mm.
the main traveler, his name is Chris Calvin,
Okay, yeah, yeah.
yeah, and
Forgot.
he has, and that's what the point is when we look at the George Clooney version of the
Mhm.
movie, and let me see, yeah. There it is all the time about like his romance that he had with his former wife,
Yeah,
and she
yeah.
suicided.
Yeah.
And that's maybe not what it's incredibly intelligent from Stanislaw Lem to introduce his wife, but it's
Well,
maybe not what the movie is about.
well, I think the point is it's not the wife, it's a simulacra of the
Hmm.
wife,
Oh, that's a good point.
right? Because they establish and they make up the science fictiony part, like made up of different particles. I think they say neutrinos, which wouldn't make sense now, but they
Hmm.
imaginary, in this context, particles that make up a person that looks like a person, but they're not alive, right?
Yeah,
And they do things.
but see, that's the interesting point, because so this Chris Kelvin,
Mhm,
he arrives on an seemingly empty space station
mhm.
that, how do you say it, circles around the planet
Yeah, it's
Solaris.
orbiting the planet. Yeah.
And Solaris is a planet that generations of scientists have researched on.
Hmm.
We get that information from the book.
Hmm.
And at first they thought it's a meaningless planet.
Yeah, but meaningless, and then there was a mystery, and there was an obsession over it for a period of time, and no one could resolve what it was. Like the
Yes.
question of what it was decided to be unresolvable, and so the book starts at a point where people don't really care. It's an unanswerable question, so people lose interest.
Mm-hmm.
And the station's in disrepair. There are only 3 other researchers there. One of them just commits suicide before he arrives. And when he arrives, he realizes that everyone there has been living with some sort of simulacra of a person in their life.
Yes. And I think his task is to figure out what happened on that space station.
I believe he was a psychologist, right?
He's right.
Yeah.
He's a psychologist.
Right, and he's working with a physicist and an engineer or something.
And it's like an empty space, because I didn't know anything when I read the book.
Yeah.
Right? He just arrives at the space station, and it's a bit of a existentialist movie where you feel like you will figure out something horrible.
Waiting for Godot, almost.
Yeah,
Almost.
That's what it is, but you feel like a standard Hollywood movie that he goes on there and then there will be a creepy alien that eats other scientists or something, but it's not, right?
And I think that's where the movie becomes hard to sell to Hollywood, because it's not about the creepy alien or the narrative. It's about a psychologist in a situation where he's alone, but the people he can connect with, they're trying to measure the situation in terms of what are these beings, right? And how does that relate to our research about the physical properties of this? And for the psychologist, he can't, because it's his dead wife or the simulacra of his dead wife, he can't but anthropomorphize her, right? He doesn't see...
Well, I mean, he doesn't know at the beginning, right?
Well, he doesn't know it at the beginning, but as it goes on, he has difficulty.
Well, let's explain the story a little bit.
Yeah.
So he comes at the station, and Solaris, first of all, it's perceived to be meaningless, but then scientists figure out that something is going on that planet. It's a planet that is, how do you say?
A living ocean, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of the perception there.
So at first it's just an ocean, but then it produces the structure that people assume, no, wait, that looks so intelligent. It must be something intelligent.
Deliberate. And there is some discussion of like reactions to human presence, right? So there would be mirroring and structures that would change in relation to humans being there, and attempts to analyze this. So the book spent a painfully long time going on about efforts to scientifically catalog the planet and to measure the structures.
You found that was painful?
Like, it was fascinating to a point, but it went on and it went on and it went on.
You know, for me, that was the most interesting point of the book.
It was interesting, but I had to put it down at times.
Oh, really?
Because I was like we were talking about reading Umberto Eco, right? And parts of that are really engaging, but then there's a tangent, and I go on tangents all the time, but with reading, if the tangent is too prolonged and it's disconnected from the rest of the narrative structure and there's no action occurring,
well,
it's hard for me to come back. Like, I felt that way with Tolkien when I was like 9 or 10, and I was just like, okay, I get it, the trees are really detailed and it's interesting, but there's a point where the detail becomes noise. For me, so like with...
So I didn't have that in that instance.
Okay.
So to me, that was like one of the intelligent twists. So at the first point, the problem is it represents a problem of science itself. You try to find what is intelligence, you try to find it in another thing, but you cannot discover what it is.
And there was a question of the methods and the methodology, right? And it felt like, whatever tools we have are broken to interpret this. In the Southern Reach trilogy, which was the first novel, there was the basis for the movie Annihilation. There's a line that I really loved where a biologist is researching this mystery area, and she's writing in a journal, and she says, our methodology is broken, right? Like, we don't know, this is so foreign to us, we don't know how to ask questions to gather meaningful information about this, because
it's very close to the topic of annihilation. There was the recent movie about aliens coming to Earth and then trying to communicate with us, right?
It was about an area where they call it a zone or a shimmer, and everything that went in, nothing came out, right? And it was expanding, and so the Americans were, because it was in an American space, and so they kept sending in these expeditions, and this woman was sent in because her husband was the only person to come back.
And she was a linguist, right?
No, no, no. That was Arrival.
Oh shit!
No,
Yeah.
no, no. But
Okay,
Arrival
okay.
and Annihilation, there are a lot of
There are
parallels.
parallels. Okay, okay.
And I made a comment on, because I've read both books and
Ah, yeah,
I've seen
yeah,
the
yeah.
movies, and I was comparing those to Under the Tuscan Sun
Uh,
and the book and the movie, and
that's the Chinese novel, right?
no,
Under
no,
the
no,
Tuscan.
no. Under the Tuscan Sun. It's also American.
It's also American.
Another. I just
Okay,
made.
wait for 1 second. We
Yeah,
can
yeah.
talk about all of this. Let's first focus on Solaris, just to summarize the basic
Yeah, to
plot.
bring back
Yeah.
the question of.
Because I think it's like, so the point that you mentioned, that it is
Mhm.
about the question, well, how do we methodologically discover something without just discovering ourselves
Yeah,
in that?
yeah.
And maybe we do that. And there were generations of scientists who were then very interested in that planet, and there were libraries just created around this topic of the planet.
Just cataloging details.
Yes,
Yeah.
the largest libraries as a scientific topic. And the planet made like these wonderful structures. Maybe I can show that here in a picture. So this was the idea, that the planet made like really wonderful structures, and nobody knew what it basically is. They just saw it as intelligent. And one day, for example, there were like 200 scientists who went into that structure exploring what it is, and it just collapsed.
Yeah.
And it buried like generations of intelligent scientists. And it brought science to a nihilism. And that nihilism,
Well, nihilism around that question, right? Because they'd mentioned like there's still people exploring and discovering other places, but that particular planet and area of inquiry, it's like we can't get any further the way we're going. And there's some question, is this indication of intelligence, or is this just a weather pattern?
yeah,
Almost.
Yeah.
And they talked about like taking boxes of samples that were in some sort of formation, and they would maintain that, but then if it was taken too far away from the planet, it would just turn into this, gray goo, essentially.
oh yeah, right.
So it felt like all of the efforts to understand it were stymied.
Yeah, and there are many theories around this planet that different scientists came up.
Yeah.
But he says none of these theories can be proven.
Well, and it kept coming back to the question, is this intelligence or is this some sort of natural phenomena? Because you can find fascinating patterns within like a cumulonimbus cloud, but that doesn't mean that the cloud itself is intelligent. It's a product of other systems. So the question of whether or not the phenomena on the planet was indicative of intelligence, and whether or not that was intelligence that we could communicate with, was confounding people. And there's some question about what kind of questions could we ask to get some sort of communication that we would understand. And I think a detail I was forgetting is right before the scientist had arrived, the psychologist, either the engineer or the physicist, had begun some sort of experiment with the planet that was controversial because there's some concern about whether or not it would damage something, to see if it could get some sort of response. And I think at some point the physicist or someone else had said, these simulacra are a response to our attempt to communicate, right? So it seems that there is an intelligent response, and we're looking for an intelligent response in our own language, right? Or in our own way of understanding the world.
We want to have an answer from the emptiness of nothing.
Yeah. Well, like we're talking about totality and infinity, right? And this is like outside the totality of what we know, but is it outside the totality of what we can know, right? And so the simulacra is perhaps an attempt to communicate.
Let me say this is the twist. So I want to say there is one theory that, for example, assumes that Solaris is a gigantic brain. That just thinks, and not thinking in a sense of self-reflection like we do, self-consciousness, but in terms of a calculation. So Stanislaw Lem had that topic before in the Death Planet.
Okay, I didn't know this.
Where scientists from Earth, they travel to Pluto.
Oh, okay.
And or was it Pluto? I think it was Pluto. And then they discover like the signs of an ancient race that built something, but they just find this gibberish. Do you say gibberish? Mass on the ground, and then they assume, oh, maybe that's we, and it just has turned itself into mere calculation.
Oh,
So
okay.
it's another step in the evolution that amounts to nothing except
Right,
for
right.
calculating all the
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
So what happens now in Solaris is that we come to the twist where he arrives on the planet, and the planet somehow communicates with humans, goes into the brain, into their brains,
Takes out a memory.
takes out the memory, and reproduces his physical representation of his wife. And that's where you turn the topic, which is merely theoretical, like, holy shit, how do I research in that? How do I put myself in there, and how do I see just myself in a mirror?
To something deeply personal.
Yes.
And inherently personal, like unavoidably personal.
And that's a genius move.
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
It is, right? Because instead of just asking about the question, what's the limit of our knowledge and our
Yeah.
methodology to ask questions, it sort of inverts our relationship to that, right? And there's awareness that maybe it's something else asking us questions that comes from intelligence that's so radically different and a methodology that's so radically different, that the modes of understanding just don't like they're incomprehensible to each other.
Yeah.
And there was a line about that as well in Annihilation, where one researcher was commenting on how advanced this intelligence was, because they couldn't, the shimmer in that space, they couldn't define it beyond being indicative of intelligence. But they were saying, like, the way it responds to us, from its perspective of consciousness, could it possibly evaluate us as being conscious? Right? Just because talking about like that huge gap in technology and an intelligence that was able to manipulate the genome and atoms, you know,
Yeah.
in a very effortless way. And we can't conceive of what that intelligence would look like. And it seems to be interacting with us, but is it interacting with us because it's conducting an experiment, or because it's trying to communicate, or because it's trying to do something completely different, and we're just incidental to its action? And there's a similar mirroring of that with Lem. So as I'm saying this, I'm actually wondering how much Southern Reach Trilogy and Annihilation was influenced by Solaris.
Yeah, that's maybe a question, or maybe they all nourish from the same spirit, zeitgeist.
Exactly, right, which, you know, exists and brings itself up in different iterations.
Yeah.
Right?
And it's also a bit of the question, like, is life fundamentally meaningless, or does God, if he exists, owe us an answer?
And as someone who's deeply agnostic,
That's a very interesting phrase. As someone who's deeply agnostic, I like that.
well, no, but
It's
that,
like, are there agnostic fundamentalists?
I mean, there are people who are radical atheists,
Yes.
but that's, you know,
But radical agnostics, I would like to meet them.
that would be interesting. No, that's a concept.
Do they have churches? Like, yeah.
Do they have coffee shops?
Oh.
Not churches.
They have the best. Yeah, it's Starbucks. No, that's an atheist coffee shop.
Is it?
Yeah, since they changed like the coffee cups and don't say Merry Christmas anymore.
Oh
Say
yeah.
Happy Holidays.
Yeah. Well,
I'm just kidding a little.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't.
No, it's in America. It's a huge discussion.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And
They claim that liberals want to kill Christianity.
I'm aware of that, and that's why the disclaimer from, you know, a relatively agnostic perspective,
Yes.
because I didn't grow up with that. I'm aware of the discussions, but I always try to keep that at arm's length, especially when looking at other things. But that question of self and other, right? And again, coming back to Levinas and the idea of that which is infinite or beyond that which we can comprehend by its definition. Yeah, I feel like perhaps with both authors, it's just a shifting the same zeitgeist, but like at a different time period, right?
Yeah.
And a different way of looking at that through speculative fiction. What I was going to mention before about Annihilation and Arrival and Under the Tuscan Sun was, there's a point, I had made a blog post about feeling sort of that I was identifying far too much with middle-aged female academics who just like lost a life partner in some context and were like trying to make sense of their lives and their work by going about some sort of radical change, right? And this is more me 5-6 years ago than me today. But I'd felt that I'd been going through those narratives and identifying with that in terms of making choices to pursue occupations or situations in my life that were radically different from what I'd done previously, to get a better understanding of how I saw myself outside of a relationship in a situation that had been deeply familiar for a very long time, right? And like when all of that gets stripped away and we have our sense of identity and our sense of work, how do we continue to develop and grow that in a particular setting?
Can you say again how that relates to Solaris?
Yes, because the psychologist is being sent to make sense of the situation. And he's having to confront something deeply personal because his wife committed suicide, I think 10 years or 12 years in the context of the movie. And then he's presented with the simulacra that's his wife as she was before or when she died. And for him,
okay, let's
his methodology is being confused by that.
Yeah, let's take a short break on that.
Okay,
That's an interesting topic.
Yeah.
We just take a short break here. If you like this content, then leave us a comment on YouTube, or you can also listen to the podcast if you want to listen to this on your way or something.
The whole conversation.
The whole conversation.
Hopefully, we'll tie up some of the tangents that we invariably.
Of course, you don't see the beautiful pictures that we have carefully chosen. So if you listen to the podcast, you can also watch it on YouTube. Okay, so here we are back with some images from Solaris, and Solaris is the question, as Ben pointed out, of the relationship between the professional methodology that we apply when we research phenomena and how it relates to our personal lives.
Well, and how the ideologies that we profess internally in some ways relate to how we look at the methodologies that we use professionally. And how it is that we ask questions both personally but also in an external professional sense. And I think that's one of the reasons that Solaris was why it's been so enduring in popularity, because it's not just a meditation on limits of professional understanding. It's how our own personal perspectives exist in a dialogue with that, right? And how that shapes how it is that we look at things and question things. And I'd mentioned sort of looking at Arrival and Annihilation and Under the Tuscan Sun, where there's a female academic in all
Under
of this.
the Tuscan Sun is what? I never heard that.
It's a chick flick.
It's a what?
A chick flick.
Oh, chick flick. Okay.
And it kind of seems out of place.
Chick flick means it's for women.
The intended audience is for women, and I shouldn't use the term chick. I don't know. I mean, I don't think that's problematic or derisive or derogatory, because like it's like rom-com, right? Or like a melodrama. But as we're talking about science fiction, speculative fiction that touches on what methodology are we using to understand alien intelligence in Annihilation and in Arrival in a very direct way, I'm including a melodrama in some ways, or what could be termed as a melodrama.
So it's not a science fiction movie?
Not at all, not at all. So I was familiar with the movie, and then I read the book, and I was horrified because the movie was a really interesting question of personal development, or movie looking at personal development and life changes. And then the book was a lot of details about renovating.
So what's the book about, or what's the movie about?
The movie, the premise is this woman, this published poet and literary critic and professor, is attending a party for one of her students who's just published a book. And he's flirting with her, right? Like he's asking, oh, can I please kiss you now, right? Because he talks about having a crush on this professor who's middle-aged but very attractive.
Yeah.
And then someone comes up and says, oh, like, you reviewed a book of mine too. and basically tells her that her husband's been having an affair and storms off. And then it cuts scene, and this woman's going through divorce, and her close friends.
And why does it relate to Solaris?
It relates to Solaris because it's a question of how, in that narrative, right, and in the other two narratives, we're talking about alienite intelligence and methodology, personal tragedy ends up being a catalyst for a process of personal inquiry that also applies to professional inquiry.
Yeah.
So there is a connection there, right? It's not that I'm
it.
just going on about this. But so in Under the Tuscan Sun, she goes on a vacation, and then she decides to change her life and live in a foreign country, right? And in Arrival, there's a character who's presented as having survived the death of a child, and processing emotional trauma because of that, and then is willing to undertake a task or a professional endeavor that's very challenging and possibly life-threatening.
Like for Chris Calvin in Solaris, it's also like he happily accepts a traumatic journey to another planet in order to...
Well, and I think with Chris Calvin, it's not a traumatic journey. It's seen as a dead end, right? Because everyone has stopped paying attention to Solaris, right? Like that question of whether or not we can answer, is this an intelligent planet? Is this a planet-sized brain? Is this some sort of proof of God? Can we relate this to how we understand alien intelligence, or an idea of the divine? Or
but
the
see,
idea
I want to interrupt you there a little bit, because I feel it's not that everyone has given up. It's more that people have converted into cynicism. They say...
Well, cynicism and apathy. So for him to go to the space station, it's not that it's traumatic, but what's the point?
But
right?
that's the traumatic abyss, right? That's when you come to the point where you realize that everything is meaningless in life. Like somebody may be killing himself or herself, and then you're confronted with the ultimate depression, the end god of depression. The end god of all gods is nothing. That's the end boss that you have to face.
I feel like I have a very, very different perspective on that. Well, no. Just because like there are so many layers there,
Sure.
And I'm not sure, like whether we're talking about like nihilism or people being at a point where there's suicidal ideation or contemplation of that. Like I feel like those are all branches that we could explore. But I think like with all four stories, there's a question of a lack of certainty of meaning, right? So there's been some sort of personal change where deeply held beliefs are suddenly thrown into question in a way that they can't be easily reconciled. And so in order to reconcile that or come to terms with that, there's a huge process of discarding of things, and a question of how do we take what's left and like rebuild our epistemic foundations from that. And I feel like as an expat and talking to a number of expats and thinking about Under the Tuscan Sun or Annihilation, I know quite a few people where there's been some sort of struggle where there's an attempt to reestablish our epistemic grounding or footing. Right? Like there's a desire for adventure and a desire for change, but we've also...
But see, this is still like when you try to reestablish your ground and your foot, you still believe in meaning. You just feel like you have to reestablish that. But once...
Maybe you don't have to reestablish it, but there is a need to ask that question. Right? Or, if I just stayed at home and continued being frustrated with work and not making any changes, like that lack of personal growth seemed worse than death to me, personally.
Right? I agree. But how do you like, you don't want to face death. You don't want to face the thing that is worse than death, right?
Stagnation.
So, stagnation,
or the shade, Tennyson.
But why is it worse than death? Like, why is it worse than death? What is it that makes it worse than death?
Death's an unknown, right? Like we were talking about
Is it
Socrates.
unknown? I
Well,
don't know.
no, but Socrates was saying like we don't know. Like it's an
Okay.
interesting question.
Uh-huh.
And Betty White, was being interviewed a few years before
She
death.
now knows.
Yeah. She was saying, my mother was saying, that person who just died, it's a big question. Now they know, right?
Yeah.
Maybe they don't know, right? I mean, if it's oblivion, there isn't
We
any
could
consciousness.
say
But
we
but
could
that's a
say
separate.
nobody knows.
No body knows. Yes.
Hmm.
So in terms
Maybe
of,
maybe the soul. Is there a soul?
I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question. I think there's a lot of value to be taken from asking that question. But to finish answer,
I have to say you're a fundamental agnostic. You're like a fundamentalist agnostic. I just heard that now in your answer.
no. How is that fundamentalist? How's that?
You say that's an interesting question. Like
Well, it is.
Yeah.
And I think the process of
But it
inquiry
seems you're less interested in the answer than you're more interested in the question.
because I don't think a definite answer is possible or necessarily useful. I think not having a definite answer might actually be more useful to our existence and might bring more meaning to our existence because we're forced to engage with that question rather than just saying, oh, I know the answer, it's on the shelf, right?
And you put it like a book in the shelf.
Yeah, exactly, and just leave it. Oh, I've read that. I don't need to open it up ever again. So I think having that as an open question is more valuable for us. And getting back to your question, how is, that repetition worse than death?
Yeah.
Like that feeling that, you've had a lot stripped away from like how your worldview was. And if you're in a place where you cannot, you're left with all this baggage, right? I hate using that term because it's cliche, but that baggage that's shaping how you look at the rest of the world. And it's like, well, I have a sense of self and I have a profession or I have, professional interests or a set of questions that I want to continue pursuing. And if I stay here, those questions will be inherently influenced by everything that's surrounding it. So there's this idea that if I change the environment, because I'm not making any progress with those questions in this environment, and this you said
that sounds so much like escapism.
Is that worse?
Isn't it escapism?
Almost, but you said, how is that worse than death? How is that stagnation worse than death?
Yeah.
And I feel like if you are not making progress in a situation and you have gone through multiple lines of inquiry to try to make progress in that situation, then for some people, not for everyone.
I agree.
Right? For some people, I think the process of like removing oneself from that environment or stripping away different things or things that we connect with our identity, because in an environment that's going to reinforce our identity, by going to a new environment, whether we like it or not, we're confronted with a different external.
Sure, but you still take your emotional body baggage with you.
Yes, and you still have to deal with that.
You are still contained in a body bag.
Yes, well, and you still have to process that.
Yeah.
Right.
By the way, you have given a perfect explanation why people love traveling nowadays so much, and like this
because of escapism.
No,
because I don't think it is escapism.
They remove themselves, and what they want to find is another environment that can recontextualize their lives and give them meaning. Right? That's what you're saying.
Recontextualize and
it's
continue
a fetishizing of the alien,
of the other, or different perspectives. Like, so I was reading something, I think in relation to Bertrand Russell and the Doors of Perception, and like not that, I've read that, but there was some commentary on that and talking about different hallucinogens being used for people who are looking for spiritual growth or spiritual development, or used in that, for some people in that process of inquiry. And that as a colloquialism in American English, that would be referred to as taking a trip, because people saw the value of that in being that by changing the environment, it would change how one perceives and responds to their internal environment.
Yeah.
And that whether that's physical travel or whether that's an altered state of consciousness, that one begins to, or is forced to look at the self in different ways. And how that relates to Solaris, you have someone who has been going through their professional lives for a span of 10 to 15 years, trying not to deal with personal trauma.
Yeah.
Right. And they've been very invested in their profession, their career. I don't remember from the book how much there's discussion of why Calvin is suddenly entering this waiting for Godot scenario, right? Like this black room where...
What do you understand by waiting for Godot?
Waiting for... I feel like I'm being put on the spot because my understanding of waiting for Godot is limited, but the situation where there's a question of the other, but an uncertainty of the answer, and that it's taking place in a void, right? So with the theater play, it's supposed to be in a room where the surroundings black.
Yeah.
So the space station,
Yeah, that's true.
there's no Starbucks at the space station, right? Like
that was the flaw. That's why everyone went crazy.
Well, but like all of
but Starbucks is the grand illusion that distracts us from the fact that we are in the greater illusion, right?
Baudrillard.
Yeah.
But I feel like with the space station, the reason I'm comparing that to Godard and the black box, or like the black curtain that, you know, the actors are playing in, is that there's nothing in the space station at the environment that anchors him to his past reality, right? So there are moments in the Tarkovsky film where he's closing his eyes and he's having this memory of childhood. And it's how this person brings a personal connection to an entire world and an entire life. And how he's having to, I don't want to say reconcile, but make sense of what that life is without that person, right? Like, is there that reality without that emotional connection? And again, that ties into our idea of our methodology and how we ask questions, and how our external methodology is shaped by the internal structures that we have that validate our reasoning and our idea of truth and our idea of logic.
I must say, so this is another question, but first of all, I must say I have a much more radical view, I believe, than you on the matter.
Please
which I will tell you in a second, because we take a short break. You can also listen to the podcast as a whole, but for this year, it's another break for our YouTube show. So leave a comment whether you found that discussion interesting or not, whether you believe in the simulation or not, whether you believe in traveling somewhere else, and whether you believe in Starbucks.
Yeah. Yeah, Starbucks and psilocybin.
What?
Starbucks and psilocybin.
Psilocybin? What is that?
A hallucinogen.
Oh, okay.
Right. So it's just the joke that, you know, different ways of, you know, traveling or finding the familiar or reconnecting with the familiar. But that's,
I can
could
see
go
your
on
position.
and I shouldn't.
No, we go on with that after a short break.
Yes.
Okay, we are back. Welcome back to our discussion on Stanislaw Solaris.
Yes.
And let's watch some pictures of the movie from Tarkovsky. I haven't watched the movie, but the pictures are just awesome, right? This is the trailer. I mean, look at him standing in this field.
Yeah. Well, and Tarkovsky does a very good job of contextualizing like what's going on with the character internally.
We don't want other worlds.
So, okay, and that's, I think, a huge point about the movie that we haven't talked about. There's a line in the book that was made into a scene by Tarkovsky, and I think in the Clooney version, but I haven't watched all of the Clooney version, where one of the things that separates or distinguishes Solaris from other science fiction at the time in its depiction of alien life is that the alien life is so radically different that we can't communicate to it or with it. And so I think the physicist or the engineer made the comment, we don't want to discover what's truly other. We can't make sense of it. We just want to hold up a mirror to ourselves. And
that's right. That's the line. That's the line. And then we want a mirror. Right?
Yeah.
That's,
well, and so a bit of disclosure. My exposure to Solaris was through a comparative literature course in science fiction. And I remember the professor making the comment, one of the things that makes the story of Solaris different than a lot of speculative fiction, makes it different than something like Star Wars or Star Trek, is that the alien that's presented in Solaris can't be reduced to. Oh, cool. I haven't seen this. It can't be reduced to, or the alien intelligence can't be
Yes,
reduced to
because she's the alien,
a
right?
political allegory,
Oh,
right?
okay.
So in Star Trek,
That's another good point.
the different aliens, they're all political allegories for things that are happening in 1960s America. Because of censorship at the time, they couldn't talk about different political situations. So instead, you have the Klingons representing the Soviet Union, or the Vulcans representing different levels of Jewish identity, right, or Israel, and you have an idea of the good guys, right, and then the other, and there are ways that they could discuss things like the Vietnam War without bringing up the Vietnam War because it was all allegorical. And whenever they had something like that, they'd distract the censors by having scantily clad women. And so people would think, oh, the show is about sexy aliens in space, when that's not it. And again, coming back to Lem saying that Tarkovsky's adaptation was structured as a romance,
Yes.
when instead it was structured as a question of how much we can understand the other, because the alien intelligence doesn't engage with us in the manner that we want to engage
And
with
how
it.
much do we just understand ourselves?
Yeah, how much are we just looking for ourselves? So with the character, she brings up a lot of questions for Kelvin about how he is looking at the world, and how his personal perceptions shape his external lines of inquiry. But one of the other characters, or possibly Kelvin at one point, bring up the question, is she a representation of the planet trying to communicate with us? Or is she the planet just trying to experiment on us?
Yeah.
Or is she the planet,
Or is she nothing?
Not being certain how to respond. And is it a knee-jerk reaction? Is it
Does she have
deliberate
consciousness?
as we'd understand it? Yeah.
Does she have consciousness as this recreation? Is she, in a sense, really, because in the first attempt, he just kills her.
Yeah.
Like the first time he says that cannot be true, he puts her like in a rocket or something. I don't remember exactly.
I think so, yeah.
And then he wants to shoot her on the planet, but I think she dies in that process.
And then she reconstitutes, and then later there's another example, like drinking liquid nitrogen, and then recovers. Yeah.
I've forgotten these parts.
Well, like with the Tarkovsky version, because again, it was a long time ago that we wrote the novel. With the Tarkovsky version, I think the physicist or the engineer had taken a blood sample or something of his simulacra. And he was like, it's not real, right? It's neutrinos or something. And you injure them and they heal, and they keep reconstituting themselves to this idea that we have of them. And they had no idea, is this an intelligent response? Is it an automatic response, the way our immune systems respond to a pathogen?
Yeah.
Right? Or is it just the cumulonimbus clouds that are just at a level of complexity that don't really have anything to do with intelligence? And if you think about something like Kurzweil and singularity is near, you could measure, intelligence or a more detailed structure in this sample of matter than you could in a rock, because there's more deliberate organization. But that
he calls it a higher complexity, right?
Yeah,
so that's a complicated notion.
But at what level is that higher complexity indicative of intelligence?
Yeah.
And what does that say about us in terms of our neurons?
Are we just complexer material things?
Yeah. Well, and what is it?
Or is there an emergent property that we just unlock, right, by going into higher levels of complexity? And then something is given to us which is available in the universe, but not directly available in the arrangement of matter.
Yeah. Well, I think like the idea that our brains and consciousness are the relation to that. It's kind of like a TV, right, taking in, single signals from something else. And that's, again, speculation. And I don't, I'm not as well versed on that.
That's all speculation, that's true. But speculation is the fundamental aspect of our lives, because it treats questions with possible answers where no answer is definitive.
Yeah. Or where the models that we have, there's a limit to them. Right.
And see, this is also a question when we look at her here. Raya, or what was her name?
Raya? That would be the English.
I don't know. Stanislaw Lem seems to use English names.
Chris Kelvin is like that seems a reference
Yeah.
to Lord Kelvin and like the measurement, the temperature
Yeah.
scale. But I think was one of the other characters Russian? I don't remember.
I think the scientists are always Russian then.
Right.
It's just
The humanities characters are
yes.
always English.
It's
Yeah.
always a child of its time, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
but however, if we look at Raya, right, and he knows he loved her, but if the planet recreates her from his memory, she feels real. She has all the elements that he has stored in himself. But has he ever seen his real wife before? If she can be just recreated by a planet.
Well,
Do you understand what I mean?
yeah, well, and when you asked earlier, the question, is she conscious? There are conversations where the apparition or the simulacra displays self-awareness.
Yeah.
And displays awareness of self, and awareness of the self as a copy of something else.
Yes.
But the scientists still don't know if that actually constitutes self-awareness,
And
or if that's the simulation of self-awareness, which again, coming back to Calvin's question, how much did he really know his wife?
Yeah, and it's also that in the moment of romance, you don't just want to love an object, right? I mean, there are weird people who marry trains and marry
TVs,
books or TVs,
yeah,
right? But what you want in the moment of
you
love,
want to find like a Leibnizian monad, right? Like another
that contains the universe as much as you contain it.
Yes. Yeah.
And maybe that gives you an answer in a duality. So psychology starts with two, not with one. And there's this romanticization of the other owing us an answer. And then we project our desire for another conscious being in the other who may be conscious or not, but we wouldn't want him to be not conscious.
Yeah.
And so if he looks at her,
he can't help but anthropomorphize her once she returns, right?
Is it anthropomorphizing? I feel like we need another term.
No, it's not anthropomorphizing, but when the physicist or engineer confronts him with, this isn't a person, this is neutrinos, or whatever the explanation is, he still has an emotional response. And the physicist is like, yeah, you're lucky you have someone that you cared about. And there's no explanation of who the physicist's simulacra was, right? Just that it was some sort of antagonist of some sort.
That's fascinating. Everyone meets his personal enemy, and your personal enemy can be love.
Well, and I'm not sure if it was a personal enemy. It was just an other, right? I don't know. Do you have a stronger opinion on that? I don't know.
That's why I wanted to say I have a more radical interpretation of the book than you.
Okay. Tell me.
Because you say death would be stagnation, which would
stagnation would be worse than death.
Worse than death.
With death, there's some uncovering or a change, whereas with stagnation, it's a repetition of that emptiness, that black room, or that space where growth isn't possible, right? And so...
Yeah, and I feel with your position, you don't face what I call the end boss, the end game. And it's not God.
Because I didn't play video games as a kid.
Yeah, okay.
Right, I mean, right, that's not...
But see, when you can imagine the scene when you come to an end boss and there's a God, right? But just imagine, and you have to fight it or something.
Didn't that happen in Pokemon? Like the Pokemon
yeah, sure.
movie?
Or like
no.
Super Mario Bros.
Even if I didn't play video games, I
or
heard
in a movie, right? You expect like the ultimate obstacle,
the revelation.
Yeah, that then like in a hero story can be overcome. But just imagine you come to the last room and the last obstacle is nothing. It's pure nothingness. And I think like any attempt to say that the possible end of ourselves is not death, and I just speculate here, right? But any attempt to say no is pulling towards, it's escaping from that question, and it's diving back into the simulation no matter what, if it is a simulation.
And I feel like there's that sense of infinite regression. Right, like when you say it's stepping out of the simulation, and then are we out of the simulation, or are we in a new simulation?
Yeah.
And then reasons the last Matrix movie wasn't that compelling for a lot of people.
Yeah.
But
Good point, yeah.
yeah, it brings up that question of infinite regression.
Mm-hmm.
And the painter painting a painting of himself, painting a painting,
Mm-hmm.
and on and on. I don't know. I don't know. And when I said previously that I'm an atheist in the sense that
Agnostic or
agnostic.
Agnostic.
Sorry, agnostic. And again, those are sometimes used interchangeably at home, but preferred definition of agnosticism. That I don't know what the answer is, but I think the process of inquiry is valuable, right? Rather than having an answer and putting that on the shelf and not touching it. That perhaps, and I think Buddhists would say this is a problem, or strict Buddhists, but that process of inquiry, that there's value in that, even if that's just moving, out of the simulation, out of the simulation, out of the simulation in a type of infinite regression.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm curious how you relate to that, how your take on the novel is more radical in terms of understanding of the other, or how we approach the other, try to approach the other.
Yeah. I mean, so I'm more on the side with you. I also agree with the fact that stagnation is worse than death, right?
Mm-hmm.
So because like the illusion that everything is nothing,
Mm-hmm.
I already said it could be an illusion.
Yeah, exactly.
So like committing to nihilism, absurdism, and all these nothingisms. Right?
Yeah. Ideologies of the emptiness or of emptiness.
Yeah. And you meet them quite often. You have mentioned the scientist who said, "Oh, she's just a bunch of neutrinos."
Yeah.
I could also say that about you.
Mm-hmm.
Like, come on. Like, yeah, you say you have consciousness and free will,
Mm-hmm.
but come on, you're just a brain on two legs. It's a TV room. It's a TV room, but then like
it's receiving a signal, but it's not producing the content of the image.
Yeah.
Right. It's playing a recording, it's not generating the movie itself.
And that will bring me to my last question, namely, what do you think who you are and how it relates to Solaris? But we will discuss that question after a short break. So if you like that, leave a comment in the comment section or subscribe to the channel and do all this stuff. And we see you again after a short break. Yeah, welcome back to our talk on Solaris. And we still watch the amazing trailer on the Tartakovsky movie.
Mm-hmm. And this is a new trailer because it's talking about more recent movies. Like we'd both read the book long before Annihilation or Arrival came out. And I hadn't seen it before we began talking about this, so I was surprised that there's that comparison to those two movies in Interstellar, because we were beginning to talk about that, and then that's how newer trailers for this very old movie are being structured, which makes sense, but I had no idea.
It's the 2001 of Russia.
Oh, okay.
I don't know.
2001?
Odyssey 2001.
Oh, yeah. A Space Odyssey.
Space Odyssey. That's what it's called.
Yeah. 2001: A Space Odyssey of Russia. Yeah.
Well,
it was for that period, and that.
Yeah. I don't know. Like, I mean, it faces the topic of nothingness again, right?
Yeah, and how it is that we engage with questions of nihilism or questions of things that challenge our belief that there's meaning in the structures around us.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd mentioned during our break, that towards the end of Foundation, which we've been talking about previously, at the end of the first season, the character Gail Dornick has a monologue.
There was the mathematician, right?
Yeah, the younger female mathematician.
The female mathematician who cracks the code.
Who is able to understand it, like the only other person who's able to understand this.
Let me just very briefly summarize. So Foundation, there is this mathematician who says this lasting empire of feudalism will break down. I have mathematically calculated. And then there's Gale, who's a mathematician who should test his theory.
Right, who understands the math in this post-AI science fiction culture. And so,
it's post-AI?
well, because the robots are all dead or killed. So there is
Yeah.
AI, but it's not, AI had advanced to the point that it was comparable or surpassed human intelligence. And then there's been, and it's not discussed too much, but there's some sort of scaling back because you don't have humanoid robots. Right? And there is one in the series, but in a sense it's post-AI. So this woman is the only other person who's able to understand this mathematics, which 20, 30 years ago would have seemed like magic, but now is allegorical with predictive analytics. So her character, towards the end of the series, or the end of the first season, has this monologue where she talks about leaps of faith, right? Or, first journeys that we go on where there's uncertainty about the outcome and uncertainty about the process and the result. And I believe she talks about like leaving the womb or, traveling to a new country or undertaking different journeys. And in the context of the series, she's undertaking a journey home where she doesn't know if there'll be a home left. And she doesn't know if she'll be alone, and she doesn't know if there'll be other people, and she doesn't know how that relates to her space in the universe. And because I feel that relates to some of the questions brought up by Solaris that we were talking about before, where when our methodologies break down and our situation's quite different, we're sometimes confronted with questions of nihilism and I think I said ideologies of nothingness or ideologies of emptiness.
I like that.
Yeah, where...
Because it's an ideology too, yeah.
Yeah, where there are things that cause people to give up hope or where there's suggestion that things break down. And when we're talking about changes in our environment that could possibly allow for growth, and we talked about annihilation and arrival in it, because it was on the scene, I want to say Interstellar. I wasn't talking about Interstellar, I was talking about Under the Tuscan Sun.
Yeah, to be honest, Interstellar is not on the same level, right?
Not at all.
Yeah.
Maybe
I love Interstellar, but...
It was fun, but okay, yeah, that's...
Let me change it to before...
Something that's more...
Now we are better.
Yeah, okay,
So.
okay. Well, and so I'd mentioned Under the Tuscan Sun because there's this personal journey that's shaping how the external world is seen. And last time we'd spoken, you'd mentioned that isn't that just a form of infinite regression? Like you're in an empty room confronted with nihilism, so you open the door and you step out, and then you step into, another room that's different, and perhaps you're leaving the simulation, you're leaving the Baudrillardian simulation or the Platonic cave, but how do we know that it's not just a larger cave or another simulation? We're leaving the Starbucks, and we're for the real world, but the real world is also
the larger Starbucks.
A construct, right? Like how is it that we leave the construct to form a more independent perception or methodology? And I feel like with Gail Dornick's character in Foundation, it's almost saying that doesn't matter, right? Like when I was saying that as an agnostic, I don't think the answer matters. I think the process of questioning matters, right? Like I don't want to just put that book on the shelf. I think there's value in that.
I mean, we have no choice.
Some people just leave it, right? Some people don't ask that, right? It's,
That's true.
we can't answer that, so why ask it?
Yeah, but even if you answer it, you still have to engage in life, right? You still have to live in the simulation.
Yes, right? Yes. But I think some people don't actively
you don't
engage
know,
with it.
You don't know whether the nothing is not just another simulation, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. There's, uncertainty. There's an unknown there. And I think with that monologue in Foundation, where she talks about leaping into that unknown, right, or embracing that unknown, and I don't recall if she describes it as a leap of faith or not. But either way, whether she doesn't, I don't think it doesn't matter because it's still there's the idea that
I'm never so satisfied with the concept of the leap of faith, which is the Kierkegaardian idea of jumping towards an irrational system and not to over-rationalize it. It's maybe an answer to believe in God.
Yeah. Well, and I've used belief in faith without that context. Like I'm trying to
A
think about,
leap of faith.
yeah, like I'm not thinking about it in that
Yeah.
specific philosophical context.
It's a leap of faith in sense of believing in life.
Yeah, or I guess maybe faith in the idea that those ideologies of nothingness or those ideologies of emptiness are not like a final destination. Because you made the video game comparison, you beat the final boss. And then what if that thing we're confronting, it isn't a revelation from God or the other, it's just an empty room. And I feel like that appeal to like that monologue and foundation suggesting, well, that doesn't matter. Like people who would argue that Nietzsche isn't a nihilist would say that that's a step and that you have to overcome that by creating meaning in your own life.
Yeah,
right. Even if that's an empty simulation, that's
creating meaning. Yeah, even if it's a simulation. Yeah. Do you believe in free will, by the way?
That's complicated. A short answer is yes.
An on-off relationship, or?
Well, no, but I mean,
it's complicated.
I feel like there are lots of logically sound arguments for determinism, but from a very pragmatic sense, if you accept deterministic arguments as a way of looking at the world, it limits the potential agency that you might have and the potential ability to step out of certain situations. So I feel like whether or not free will is real or an illusion, in some ways I feel like if it's a lie, it's a pragmatic lie. And if it's true, then it's a really dangerous deception to assume that it's not true. So we talked a bit about Harari.
Wait, what is a deception? What is a dangerous deception?
To believe that it's not, to believe in determinism if free will is true, right? So like when we were talking about reductionism or Dadaism previously, and I'd mentioned Noah Yuval Harari talking about ideas about consciousness in relation to how some modern technologies give possible explanations for the limit of that. And he presents a very reductionist approach. And it's kind of hard to tell whether he's presenting that as a foil that he wants the reader to respond against, or whether he sincerely believes that. Like for me, and I haven't spent a lot of time reading it, but just when I was reading it, that was my response. Like,
what did he say? Like you said, a very reductionist approach. He says there's no free will, or everything is matter.
He said, nothing's matter, and that in terms of societies trying to maximize happiness, that can all be reduced to neurotransmitters. And when we get to the point where we can just maintain that through neurotransmitters in a particular way, it's if we have an algorithm that tells us, how we might make our best choices, why would we not follow that? And I think he's setting up certain types of technology-based ideologies, or like futurist ideologies.
He's provoking.
Yeah, I think that's what he's doing, although the way he presents it, it's ambiguous. And in some ways, maybe he's making fun of writers like Kurzweil. Right? But he leaves it ambiguous, deliberately so. And I think, I'm hoping he's setting it up as a foil. I'm assuming he's intelligent enough that that's the intention. Although it's quite possible that that's not the case. So again, coming back to that question of free will, I feel that determinism is a much more problematic viewpoint than
free will.
Than believing in free will, even if it's a false belief. Right? Personally, right? So that's my answer in a nutshell.
I mean, if it's a false belief, then it is determined by determinism to be that false belief.
Right.
So it's intended anyway to live in that
kind of illusion. So it's a moot point. And I don't want to go through proofs for or against determinism, because we could do that, and I'm sure you could find those online.
Well, I think it's a metaphysical subject. It's not an empirical subject. So it's open for speculation. I think we should see it as a speculative topic.
It's open. I agree with you, but I think Harari is writing in an environment where there are some people who are holding up machine learning as a panacea for all of our theoretical model, again, like coming back to what we discussed, where people saw
There are,
correlation as more
let's say it like
valuable.
that. There are a lot of, let's call them empirical positivists.
Yeah.
Empiricism is not a discipline that is inherently wrong, but if you combine it with a metaphysical theory of positivism, so that the universe is just consisting of atoms and nothing else, that's a very simplified view of positivism, of course, then it becomes an ideology again.
Right.
So,
Yeah,
and I think we have to open all of these topics up for speculation, and theory that I try to develop is more thinking in terms of possibilities.
yeah,
So I have to
yeah.
think myself always as free and as determined at the same time, as a kind of contradiction.
Yeah, yeah,
And that's also what Nietzsche tries to establish, in my mind, by the way. He talks about the human being as an ultimate paradox, that is its own nature in not having a nature.
yeah.
So, and it can say no towards nature. It's a
Deeply,
no sayer.
deeply existential.
Yeah.
Right.
And the no saying creates a distance of you towards yourself. And that's maybe also the ultimate no, is the idea of killing yourself.
Well, the idea of self-negation,
Yeah.
whether that's in terms of suicide, but also sometimes I think in self-doubt, right? Like that involves a process of negation.
Yes.
Self-negation where you're questioning things that you've taken as true. And with Solaris and the other stories we're mentioning, not Foundation, but the other science fiction movies based on novels, all of the characters are in a situation where something external has happened, where they're having to ask questions about the foundations that they use to form their worldview or
And
shape
where they
their
have to negate something about themselves.
yeah, or where they're something about themselves and looking at the world. And I feel like, again, like with those three examples, they do that through negating something in their environment.
Omnis Spinoza says, and I'm always proud to say something in Latin because it
Please.
sounds I'm very educated. And then most of the time I say it completely slaughtering Latin and saying it in the wrong way. But Spinoza says, omnis determinatio est negatio. So that means that everything that we know as something determinate, for example, here my cell phone, it's technically the result of a negation we do. We negate it like by saying, oh, it's not Ben, it's not the environment that surrounds it. And we separate it by negation, but we don't fill it up with an internal essence that we identify. So that's a basic theory of Spinoza that also Brandom takes over nowadays.
Not as familiar, but yeah.
Brandom is also like regarded as one of the big philosophers of our time, right? Which is debatable. But yeah, I by the way, I wonder, I have more to say about that, but I just wonder right now, do you remember the end of Solaris? I just realized during our discussion, the book is fascinating, and I have forgotten entirely how it ends.
The book I forget. In reading up on it, the movie ends differently. So the Tarkovsky movie, he goes down onto the planet, onto a surface area of the planet.
You watched the movie?
Yeah.
Oh, was it good?
I liked it, yeah. I mean, different expectations with it. I was surprised by the production values. But he goes down onto the planet and he meets his father, and then he switches to this memory, as though he's living in this memory of his childhood that had been coming up throughout the film again and again. So it's as though by going down to the planet, he's surrounded by a different reality that was all internal to himself. In the book, which again I think was about 15 years ago for me, I don't recall. Like I feel like it was just left as the purpose of trying to answer that question was unresolved.
I feel like he left the planet. I feel like he left it.
And I don't remember if he left the planet or if someone left or if everyone left. I don't recall. I don't know if they left the space station.
Did he destroy something?
Yeah.
But you know, the interesting thing is like the movie of Tarkovsky is him diving back into the illusion. And that was the question that you asked me. So I think, okay, like nothingness may also be an ideology, an illusion. So we also, if we really want to be serious about critically examining our life, then we also have to ask whether any ideology of illusions is an illusion, right?
Yeah, of course,
So,
of course.
And so the idea is that even though you live in an illusion,
Mm-hmm.
let's say we live in the Matrix,
Mm-hmm.
the things we do in the Matrix still have a
Meaning
value of
within that
reality.
context. Yeah.
Yeah, meaning they are internally real,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it ultimately does not matter whether you are an illusion or not, because what matters is what can you do with the freedom that you perceive here at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanna give one last question with regard to that, because I had a girlfriend once. She was studying psychiatry. She was becoming a psychiatrist. She studied medicine before,
Mm-hmm.
and she was very much also in neurology.
Mm-hmm.
And she always said that our self-perception of who we are, self-consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
is an illusion. And I always ask the question, an illusion for whom?
Mm-hmm.
For what is it an illusion? And she just kept like she
Repeated
didn't
it
understand what I mean.
without adding content. Yeah.
She was just repeating, well, it's an illusion.
Repeating without adding content, without
Yeah.
adding justification.
Oh,
And
no, she said it's an illusion for an illusion. But I think an illusion has to be an illusion
relative to something.
that is different than
Yeah.
the illusion.
Yeah, yeah, it's in context.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and the idea of the simulacra initially, right, was that it's a copy of some sort of original, even if Baudrillard suggests that we're in a space where that idea of authenticity no longer exists. And we spoke a bit before about how that idea of authenticity that exists persistently in our lives, and in some places that's very useful.
Yeah.
And then in others, it's not. So there might be ideas about love or perception of the other, even if it's all an internal construct, being very valuable, and an internal construct that gets reinforced by external actions on both ends. And so that perception of authenticity is very useful, whereas something like national identity might be a perception of authenticity that's less valuable.
Oh,
Right.
yeah.
I don't know.
Good point. That relates us to another topic that we
we'll
also
cover
want to
soon.
talk about.
Yeah,
I think that was a very good talk. You
Yeah,
made
yeah.
many interesting points that at the same time initiated like these cascades of further thoughts that I have.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you.
um,
Likewise.
Yeah, I hope you enjoyed it, like whoever was listening. Not many listeners, but it's 10
More,
people.
more.
10
That's
people
good.
who are
That's
interested in the
amazing.
topic.
Yeah,
Yeah, so I enjoy like interacting with them. So yeah, if you enjoyed that, then leave us a like. Subscribe to subscribe to everything that I have on the internet, right? But especially to this channel, which is about philosophy and the future. And you can also listen to the podcast. Thank you very much. And do you want to say something?
Thank you for listening. No, this was fun. This was fun. I think as we talk about external reality and internal reality, and how sometimes concerns about external realities are moot, this was an enjoyable way to spend time, whether there are 10 people or 10,000 watching. So thank you. Thank you for this. Thank you for this space.
So I just say, live long, enjoy the simulation. Enjoy the simulation and prosper.